Kalispera sas. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third talk of the 2023 Dardalis Hellenic Archives Research Seminar Series. My name is Steffi Nikoloudis, and I'm from La Trobe's Greek Studies program. On behalf of the Greek Studies program at La Trobe University, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we've gathered tonight, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the long-term benefactor of the Greek Studies program, the late Mr. Anastasios Vassilogiannis, all recent donors, and the major original benefactor associated with the archives, Mr. Zisis Dardalis, who sadly passed away earlier this year. This series honours his legacy. The Greek Studies program would like to thank both the Dardalis archives at La Trobe and the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria for accepting our invitation to jointly present this second series of talks. The first one was in 2019, before COVID. And we'd also, of course, like to thank all of you for supporting this initiative by attending tonight. The aim of the series is to bring together academics and members of the public in order to explore the Greek-Australian migration stories contained in the Dardalis archives of the Hellenic diaspora. And in this way, this series combines three strategic goals of the university: education, research, and community engagement. The Dardalis archives are a unique resource of national and international significance. They include photos, books, correspondence, films, cinematic equipment, and much more, all donated by members of the local Greek-Australian community, and all these items reflect in their own way the aspects of the migration of Greek-Australians to Australia, of Greeks to Australia, especially during the post-World War II period, but also earlier. So our aim is to explore the Greek-Australian experience through the contents of the collection. And for that purpose, to that end, we've asked our speakers to select an object from the archives as a starting point for their presentations. Tonight, we're privileged to have with us one of Australia's most distinguished historians, Professor Joy Damousi. Professor of History, Director of the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, and Dean of Arts at the Australian Catholic University, Joy is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and of the Australian Academy of the Social Sciences. She has published widely on gender, history, the effects of war and migration, and refugee history. Her recent books include Memory and Migration in the Shadow of War, Australia's Greek Immigrants After World War II and the Greek Civil War, published in 2015, and The Humanities, Child War Refugees and Australian Humanitarianism in a Transnational World, 1919 to 1975, published last year. She's also co-author of Footy Passions from 2009, an exploration of the central role of sport in our lives and in the community more broadly. I've personally had the privilege of working briefly with Joy on one of her past projects, and I've witnessed for myself the joy that Professor Damousi the joy with which she explores her subject matter and brings together disparate pieces of evidence to craft her narrative. And I know that we're in for a treat tonight. Thank you so much, Joy, for taking time out of your very busy life to participate in this series and to speak to us about sport and community. Thank you.
Thank you, Steffi, for that lovely introduction. And it's always an absolute privilege to be here at the Greek Community Centre and to talk about Greek history and migration and diaspora. So really, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I too would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So, here we are, sport and the Greek community. I have both a professional and a personal interest in this story, which will come out in the talk, I think. Professional because, as Steffi said, I've actually worked in the field of sports history. My colleague John Cash and I wrote a book called Footy Passions, which was, it asked the question, why do people get so passionate about football? And in that book is a chapter on migration, and I'll come to that in a moment, or later on. Personal because, of course, as you will see during the course of the presentation, I myself have great passions for sport and particular teams. I won't tell you what they are right now. You might want to guess them. But I have an involvement, as many here would probably have an involvement as well. But I think this story and this theme really is a compelling one because, as I hope to show tonight, sport has been absolutely fundamental and a great constant in Greek history. It has been ever present in all stages of Greek history and, of course, in particular in the history of the diaspora, whether it be Australia, the US, Canada and so on. So I think we can say, as I'm hoping to demonstrate, it is really at the heart of a lot of not only activity of Greeks, whether they be in Greece but also in other contexts, but also that sport provided and continues to provide a vehicle for the expression of Greek identity and Greek culture, of Greekness. So one of the things I want to explore tonight is almost a paradox, that at the same time that sport provides that vehicle for Greek identity, it also allows for an integration and becoming part of mainstream society. So it sort of works on both levels, and I want to talk a little bit about that and actually explore some of the tensions of that, independent Greek identity and assertiveness of identity, but then actually integrating or being part of the wider society. So it works on both levels. So there's sort of some of the things I want to talk about, particularly in the period that probably we know best, which is the post-war period. But of course we have classicists here in the audience, and I know probably who will listen to this lecture. So I'm going to begin in a much earlier period. So I'm going to begin with the ancient world. And just to set the scene and set the context, that the Greek sporting traditions began with ancient Greece, of course, all through to modern Greece. And this is a story and a history many of you will be familiar with, but I thought it'd be worthwhile highlighting these themes tonight because sport is not static. As a practice and as an activity, it's never a static thing, it's always changing. And it's always changing because communities always are flexible in terms of how they perform sport in the culture and the circumstance and the historic moment they're in. And I think if we look at the periods, the ancient Greek period, the Hellenistic age, the Byzantine, of course, the Ottoman Greece and modern Greece, we see sport both a constant but also a changing entity. So I think this gives us a richness and really allows us to identify how layered and rich sport is when we're looking at Greek culture and society. So let's begin with the world that many of us are familiar with, which is the ancient Greek world. So many of you will know, sport in antiquity was very, written about and described and well documented. We have descriptions of games in Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey. Both works are really detailed sporting activity in both these works. So the Iliad records funereal games held beside the funereal pyre, and what's described here are the chariot races, the boxing, the wrestling, the running, the discus throwing. All these activities are documented in the Iliad. It's very active and a very dynamic part of that society. In the Odyssey, we have athletic contests described as well, and in the Odyssey is the first use of the word athlete in Western literature. So, Greek culture and society is central to this story. In in both texts we see, how Greeks were so keenly committed to sports. We also know that, and I'll come back to this, gymnastics was central to this world. It reached its peak in ancient Athens and was a vital part of Greek, educating Greek young men, particularly from the 7th to the 2nd centuries, in the ideals of the body and the mind and the relationship between the body and the mind, educating men in those areas, and being central to the ideals of Athenian male youth. And this story really points to another theme here, and that is the one of gender. So this is very much a male story. It's the men who are doing all these jumping around and, athletics and discus throwing and so on. It is the men who are part of this education through gymnastics and the sporting prowess and excellence. And we'll come back to that theme, but it's very much sort of central to ideas about that ancient world. However, we do have evidence of women participating in games, and this is often an unrecognised story, particularly in the ancient world. The Heraian Games, ancient Greek women, and there are texts of ancient Greek evidence of women participating in games, and particularly around the 2nd century AD, exclusively for women. Of course, they're all gender segregated, the Heraian Games. And this largely involved running, sprinting. There were sprinting competitions, and I've got there up on the PowerPoint the various sort of events that were held over various lengths. And I think this is a really interesting part of this story, which of course is so male-dominated and dominated by the male narrative. And here we have a bronze sculpture of a female athlete from 560 BC, which is quite extraordinary. So it's not that women weren't participating at one level, but of course in the culture of the day, in the gender politics of the time, in the way society was structured, it was the male athlete that embodied Greekness, Greek identity, and the relationship of sport to those aspects of Greek life. So just to move it on a little bit, the Hellenistic age and the Roman period. I'm not going to give a lecture of the classics here, but just to flag that Alexander the Great was a passionate sports athlete himself, and loved sports. He was an accomplished athlete and really promoted the sports under his reign or under his empire. And right across his empire, we see that sports was very significant. Again, especially the gymnasium, which was central to social and cultural life. Games and festivals, always included a sporting component, and they continued, of course, after Alexander's death. Now, games and festivals were really coupled together. A lot of the games were played at festivals, at occasions like that, and so under Alexander the Great, there was, much of this was seen as a central part of culture. So there's a constant here, but it is changing in terms of this type of sports that were played and where they were played. By 146 BC, the Greek world came under Roman occupation, and again, sport was active in that period, but it started to shift as well away from that Athenian educative sort of approach to the body and the mind to something a lot more physical and geared around war, right? The preparation of war and the preparation of sport for men to go into battle. So if we do look at the Byzantine sort of period, again, it's central to it. Chariot racing, spectator sports, foot racing, wrestling, the hippodromes that become a striking aspect of this period, accommodate up to 50,000 people. And again, this is very much a male space and only men could attend and participate. But here we have a sort of distinction between the ancient Greeks, who saw the physical and the spiritual qualities needed to be developed in men particularly, but the Byzantines very much saw sport as a recreational aspect only. So you've got these different narratives about recreation, about festivals, about the spiritual and the physical. So they're working on different levels, and sport takes on a sort of, you know, different meaning in these different contexts. As we move to the Ottoman period, so we have various parts of this history. The Kleftes, who were in the mountains there, who resisted life under Turkish occupation, they themselves took on sport as a central part of their activity. Group sport was in large part war games for them and that emerged under the Ottoman Greece Empire, or under that period. And so this question of sort of effectively sport being a training ground for war, because it focused on strength, endurance and speed. So what we're looking at is this relationship between sport, masculinity and war. Key elements of that, of sporting discipline, these were the essential elements: quick movement and speed, of course. Wrestling is a test of strength. So that is one narrative of sport. The other, of course, is that entertainment theme in village festivals and having that more recreational aspect. And again, these village meetings and festivals become a site of that more entertaining sort of narrative. Just to go back to that point about sport, masculinity and war, that of course, throughout as we get into the 19th century and well into the 20th century, those dimensions are really fundamental. And on the eve of the First World War, we see the mentality around sport is very much tied to masculinity and war. And so, you know, that becomes a massive theme when nations go to war, that men are prepared, men are fit, and so the sport metaphors and narratives are very much part of World War I and actually World War II as well, when war begins. So these are sort of enduring themes, actually, just more generally. I'll come back to village festivals and, meetings and festivals, because that too is something that gets transposed into, very much into the 20th century and within the diaspora, but I'll come back to that. And of course, the last of these sort of historic slides of pre-20th century is the story we all know of modern Greece, 1821 to 1896. Greece was liberated from the Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and we see over this period the emergence of the modern day Olympics. Again, men are dominating the story. Traditional sports are in place throughout during the Olympics. The Olympic Games in 1896, when they first opened to the world, represented, really decades of preparation and Olympic sort of meetings, but it was the first modern Olympics, of course, in 1896. And Greece, has its whole identity, or much of its identity in modern Greece is tied to this story of the Olympics. So I just wanted to give that broad brush stroke, because it is very interesting, I think, that sport remains a constant in war, revolution, empire, and yet it's there all the time in different ways and different contexts. Let's fast forward then to the 20th century, and this is a slide about Australia's sport and the diaspora before 1945. So we can see our Apollo team make a reappearance here. That's the photo again. The point I want to make about this period, which is really the 20s and 30s, is the role of annual picnics from Greek regions in fostering sport, community involvement and ethnic identity in the 1920s. And the festivals that I mentioned of the earlier period are sort of a sort of thread into the picnics of that early to mid 20th century. The picnics are the place where there is, at this time, in the 20s and 30s, a very strong sense of community. They're also very regional, right? So you've got communities from Macedonia, from Kythera, from Roriso. You've got all these Greek communities, and they come together in these picnics and compete against each other in these athletic events. It's not terribly structured, it's kind of obviously amateur, but the picnics are where these sort of events come together. The first collective community picnic event where you had athletes from different communities coming together was in 1935, and there were 4 fraternities that provided athletes for these competitions. About 500 people attended, and they really united Greeks around their community, but also their identity. The church took a great role in this. The Greek Orthodox Church was very active in promoting these games at these picnics, presenting prizes and so on. So you see these photos represent that. I particularly like this photo here, which shows Greek women dancing at a picnic in New South Wales in 1923. And they're showing the Greek flag, and I think that symbolises very much this way in which these picnics were central to identification as Greeks and their communities. We don't know a lot about the Apollo Club, which is that photo that Steffi gave me to think about in terms of a story. Obviously, they were triumphant in 1935 and were at that first Pan community picnic that took place between the various communities. We all know that right throughout the 20th century, picnics are central. We can come back to the whole notion of a Greek picnic, growing up with Greek picnics and how important they are. But in terms of sport and the development of sport in the diaspora, this is where the sport really took place in a sort of organised way. I should also say there's lots of other things to say about the 20s and 30s. In 1925, we had the first Greek Boy Scouts that was set up. That was set up in Sydney. And, you know, that too was about bringing youth together. Youth are central to the endeavours of the Greek community for the continuation of culture and identity, and even more accentuated in Australia, where there were so few Greeks in the 20s and 30s. So to gather the youth and imbue them with that Greekness was really important in cultural terms. So the other big sort of sport, if you like, at this time, and this was much more on an organised level, was wrestling. And wrestling was a huge sport around the world in the early part of the 20th century. I mean, I believe it still is, but I have no interest in it myself. But as a historian, I do know in the early parts of the 20th century, wrestling was huge. And again, a very male-dominated sport. And I've just got there's some good photos here of Greek wrestling in the diaspora here. And the top photo is of the group of men who organised wrestling and in Australia, but also organised Greek wrestlers to come out to Australia. Jim Lindos is one of the better known Greek wrestlers of this period in the 30s who came out and was an absolute sensation in Australia, but particularly within the Greek community, bringing them out. And I've just got there a lovely broadcast advertisement for wrestling on the radio in this period, 3LO Melbourne. So Greeks were very much developing their own sort of clubs, societies, perspectives on sport, internally, in other words, keeping it within a Greek community, but in doing so, both maintaining that Greek identity and yet also embedding themselves in Australian culture and society. So the story, of course, gets more complicated with the influx of Greeks after the war. And we all know that there's a huge influx after 1945 And and this is significant, just to remind you that between 1947 and 1972, there's over 200,000 Greeks who arrive in this country. The Greek migrants after World War II are more diverse than their pre-war predecessors. Pre-war, they come largely from the islands, Ithaca, Kythera, Samos, Castellanos, or post-war from Florina, Kozani, Costa Rica. The diversity begins to expand the Greek community around different regions. What's interesting about the Greek community, that it is one of the most highly organised post-war migrant groups. Greeks come here and they organise immediately into sporting clubs, into religious fraternities, into political clubs, into philanthropic organisations, the churches, of course, but there is a Greek group for everyone. And it's a really interesting phenomenon about that Greek community coming out at that time. It was amongst the first to establish the schools and educational organisations, to support theatre and the performing arts, to establish newspapers, of course, and radio stations. So it's a very vibrant community after the war, and over this period, 1940 to 1960, of course, again, aiming to unify the Greek community, enhancing its cultural identity, and promoting the interest as well of Greek Australians. So the sporting bodies at this time, as I say, played, I think, an important part in both integrating Greeks but also retaining that Greek identity. Now, these images are really interesting because the youth clubs that were set up over this period, 1945 to 60, again, aimed to look to the future of the Greek community in Australia. It was really important that the youth understood, youth who were young when they arrived or born here, understood that it's important for the Greek identity to keep going, and sport was a fantastic way to maintain this identity and Greek values and so on. I've put this up intentionally because we will come to soccer, but I just want to highlight also how Greek sport involved tennis and rugby as well. I mean, we're talking about a whole range of sports. I mean, the soccer story will come, and I know that's the main one people talk about. But, you know, we have tennis clubs and rugby clubs here established in the 40s, immediately after the war, that compete as regional groups around their communities. It's a complex story, and I think it's one that deserves more kind of recognition of how diverse actually the sporting activities were. Women's sport, as I said from the get-go, was really very minimal. Here we have the Hellenic netball team of 1948, but there were very few women's teams that were founded. The Perth Hellenic Youth Club and the Hellenic netball team of 48, as I say, is one of the very few that I've been able to find actually, but there must have been others because they must have competed against other teams, but I haven't been able to find much information about those. So we can see some evidence here of the embracing of women's sport in the 40s through this netball team. Again, the promotion of youth around the cultural expression of Greekness. I guess, so let's get to the 50s through to the 70s. Obviously, the Greek soccer clubs, which I'll talk about in a moment, promoted Panhellenism in Australia, and there was a proliferation of soccer teams, particularly in Melbourne, but right across Australia, which was an explosion of sporting activity, male sporting activity. And so you've got these teams here, and I've got just a few up on the screen there. It became the really most significant platform of Greek sporting prowess in this country. Again, to highlight women's roles, largely social, largely cultural, largely domestic duties, keeping a lot of these sporting clubs going. but the men were really the key activists and activists in the actual sport and delivering on the sport. Okay, so in the 1950s, Greek ethnic soccer teams are formed. And some of the examples here are Sydney Olympic in 1957, Canberra Olympic 1956, South Melbourne Hellas, which many of you might recall, 1959, Megan Alexandros in 1958. And there are many, many others. I've just named a few there. This, of course, reflected the nationalism and ethnic identity of an era, in an era of assimilation. So I find this very interesting. In the 50s and 60s, when the Greeks come to Australia, when any migrant group comes to Australia, they are expected to assimilate, to become Australians. They're called new Australians. They're expected to drop their language, to become Aussies, you know, and really integrate and drop and to assume all things Australian. This is a sort of counterattack, if you like, to that assimilationist endeavour. And it's a very interesting story, I think, that both stand, the government policy is one thing and the actual practice on the ground is another. So it's an era of assimilation, but you can see a very proud assertion of Greek identity in the formation of these clubs. So in the 1960s, you get the competition of state leagues, and in 1977, you get the National Soccer League, which becomes a national competition. In the 80s, attendances start to decline, and increasingly the Australian soccer authorities believe that this identity and ethnic identity around a soccer club needs to be dropped. So no team is allowed in 1992 to play in the Australian Soccer Federation with an ethnic name. And this is quite a significant move, right? So there's massive resistance from the clubs on this. It's a really interesting story about how this and why this happens. But it takes them, you know, 40 years of soccer being very successful and these ethnic groups playing against each other. But then in 1996, significantly, clubs all over the country were instructed to change their emblem and their name in an attempt to move soccer into the Australian mainstream and away from direct club level association with its migrant roots. It's a very significant moment in the history of these groups and the history of diaspora, I think, in Australia. There's, again, as I say, there's a lot of resistance from the clubs, but that was made the law, and in fact, those ethnic kind of names and emblems were dropped, and from there on they became South Melbourne or, you know, more generic names. It's an interesting story, and we can sort of reflect on why that move was made. You know, this kind of push, while Australia was embracing multiculturalism, it only embraced it to a certain point, and that there was still an expectation that we'd all become Australian, and these ethnic tensions, ethnic animosities that might have broken out in the soccer field, which they did from time to time, Australian authorities were not sympathetic. That didn't stop, of course, allegiance to region and allegiance to ethnicity, and I've just put up, rather naughtily, Juventus, who won a remarkable 6 out of 7 championships between 1952 and 1958, this sort of Yugoslavian team, as it was called then. Sorry? Italian, sorry, thanks, Nick. Yep, okay. Very successful team. So I think integration versus enclave of ethnic cultures, you know, how do we read this story? How do we read this history where these ethnic identities are dissipated and disappear? Because it's a rich part of Australian fabric and tapestry of life that we have these communities, but it's sort of almost saying, well, we want migration, but we don't want migrants, if you get my story. 1976, South Melbourne Hellas playing its final season in the Victorian State League before joining the newly formed National Soccer League in 1977. And of course, reasonably soon after that, it starts to, it changes its name as well. So I think this is a really pivotal moment in the history of Greek diaspora and sport. And now, of course, we have generic names. So we can possibly come back to that and discuss that a bit more. An important part of this story, of course, is spectatorship. Now, I've coupled this with women because women, you know, at that time were not playing in these teams. But women participated at many levels, and one of the most significant levels was as spectators. And they would go to the soccer and get, you know, obviously get very passionate and very involved in the soccer. I've got there a story in 2014 where there was a report of a devoted supporter of the Greek Australian soccer team, West Adelaide Hellas, a Cypriot Australian, Kilo Mostridis. She was 104 at that time, but she'd been a fan all her life since she'd migrated from Cyprus decades before, and most of her children and grandchildren and so on played for the Hellas over the years. And it's a great story because her whole life became part of this and integrated within this beautiful club, right? So this is her involvement in the club. And I have here from Konstantina Dunis, who is with us tonight. Thank you, Konstantina, for coming. Konstantina's written this spectacularly beautiful poem about spectatorship, and I think it sums up so eloquently why sport touches us and how it touches us. So I'm going to read it. I've got the privilege here of the floor, so I can read it. It's called Soccer at Middle Park. How well I remember going to the soccer when I was little, an exciting family outing, parking the cars on the other side of the railway tracks, entering the stadium and taking our seats. My mother would bring an assortment of treats, oranges, nuts and cake. Passing them along, we would take them absent-mindedly, our eyes transfixed on the game. Clear-cut loyalties back then. We barracked for the Greek team, near hysteria at every goal, and the odd brawl providing laughter and heated debates, momentary diversions from the back-breaking toil of the coming week. It's beautiful, Konstantina, thank you. I particularly like that final line because sport, as we know, is a great release for people. It's a great form of escape for people. It always has been, always will be. And I think for many of those migrant communities and hard-working migrants of those eras, you know, when they were in the factories and worked for hours and so on, sport served a fabulous cultural but, you know, enjoyable purpose of getting out and really imbibing in that sort of atmosphere and that culture. So thank you for that fantastic poem. Spectatorship is what it's all about, and you can see the crowds at that event there. And I think this poem really beautifully encapsulates that whole way soccer is a family gathering at the time, you know, in that way that sport in the 70s was quite pre-professional, a bit amateur, and you know, rock up with cars and bring food. So it brought the family together, but also all of us in that endeavour, of cultural endeavour. So I'm going to now in the talk do a little bit of a gear shift and start sort of reflecting on different aspects of sport in the Greek community here in Australia. This is a more familiar story and there's lots more to say. I haven't at all covered it. But the next few slides really highlight, I suppose, other dimensions that Greeks were involved in this society. And this will reveal my sporting allegiances. So the VFL, AFL has a very rich history of players from Greek heritage playing for various clubs. There is actually a Greek team of the century. So we've fielded enough players to constitute that. This is a fabulous story. Quite a well-known one for those of you who are, you know, tragic Collingwood supporters. So the Panhellenic family has a very close association with the Collingwood Football Club. During the period of assimilation, of course, the name was shortened to Panem, and John Panemopoulos came in 1855 to Australia. He shortened his name, and his children, Charlie Panem, born in 1874 to 1952, and Albert Panem, 1882 to 1968, were both icons of the Collingwood Football Club at that time. They were some of the best known players and were quite famous in Melbourne. Of course, the Collingwood stars Lou Richards and Ron Richards were the grandsons of Charlie Panem Sr. So yes, there is a direct line to Lou Richards. There you are. So, you know, sometimes these stories are hidden behind. This is why we have to do research to sort of expose these sort of threads in the past. And you can see there the visual representations of the family. But I think this again comes back to the changing the name at the time, very standard, very common. I think with a name like Panemopoulos, John wasn't going to go far in this society, so, you know, everyone shortened the name. And so it's a very rich story, that one. Closer to home, and I guess more recently, we have the presence of Greek players in the AFL, and this is part of the history which perhaps touches a number of us who grew up in Melbourne and followed the teams. And just on a personal note here, this is the way sport can operate, I think, on many levels. One of the most fierce and intense discussions I would have with my father was about which code is better, soccer or Australian rules. And here I was, a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old or whatever, following the Aussie game. And here he was, South Melbourne Hellas man. And we would have these fierce debates about it. You know, he'd bait me all the time. But it was really interesting because he never himself took on this game. I mean, many of those migrants did. They became, you know, real supporters of AFL. But just moving into that 80s and 90s period, we can pinpoint many players who really made their name in AFL. And I've just listed a number up there. Anthony Koutafidis, of course, born in 1973, from Carlton Football Club. Peter Dacos, 1961, from Collingwood. Andrew Demetriou, North Melbourne, 61. Angelo Lekos, 1974, played for Hawthorn. And Spiro Malakelis, born in 1968, played for Geelong. So this is a period of multiculturalism. Notice no one's changing their names, or maybe a little bit. They're anglicised, but, you know, there's probably more of an acceptance of Greek names at this point. So, you know, there's a lot of stories around how many of these players and the fact that they were Greek or from Greek background or Greek heritage was really quite inspiring for many young men, particularly, coming through. And what they were able to achieve and the heights they reached as footballers. Having said that, of course, racism in the game was rampant, as it has been up until very recently, still is. But in the 80s and 90s, you know, while we can celebrate the presence of a Greek kind of profile, it also was the source of abuse and racism at games. So, you know, it's always a tension there. Women's contributions, we know that LET, Ni Glutafidis, was the first female AFL umpire. And in the AFLW now, we've got Madison Prespakis, Indigenous and Greek Heritage, 2020 Best and Fairest player. She's played for Essendon Carlton. Nicola Xenos from St Kilda and Georgina Patrikois from St Kilda. You're getting the second, third generation now of Greeks coming through, playing games like this, getting a profile, but significantly now for women, the AFW is providing a fantastic forum for them. This is a story, I've kept the story to a sort of domestic and local level. Let me just take us briefly down to an international level. And these are players you all know, or people you all know, of course. Greek-Australian representation internationally. Nick Kyrgios needs no description. Thanasi Kokinakis doesn't need any either. And a very young-looking Ange Postecoglou, who at 21 here at the South Melbourne Hellas Football Club in 1986. Yeah, I mean, I think second generation, third generation Greek Australians are starting to really make their place in the world. And again, we're looking at men. I don't think I've got some women coming up, but it won't be too long before I think women start to break into that scene as well. One of the interesting phenomena as well of the Greek community in sport is how they have embraced Greek sports stars. And Stefanos Tsitsipas, of course, the Greek tennis player here, plays his matches in Melbourne to adoring fans and massive crowds. And again, the Greek flags coming out when he's played. Interestingly, this one's against an Australian player, so again, the allegiance is to Greece. And if we're going to continue this international sort of thread here, we can look recently at the Tokyo Games, where a number of Greek Australians have engaged in and participated in sports. Dylan Peredes represented Australia in the men's football team. Alexandra Aristoteli in gymnastics. So you can see, again, they're probably third generation Greek Australians who were involved in the Tokyo Olympics. Of course, Kyrgios himself, and Talia Tsikoronis made her debut in the softball team. So she has been playing softball for many years around in New South Wales, and she kind of realised her Olympic dream in Sydney and returned to Tokyo as well. And just finally, Anthony Hydrostanos, water polo, and Leah Yanitsas, water polo as well. So I think it's really another part of the story, the way the Greeks have involved internationally as well, and continuing that heritage. So some of the themes I think we can reflect on in this talk and the themes that come out. Obviously, sport provided a forum, a fundamental and important forum for the expression of Greek identity in Australia in the early and to late 20th century, notable through social interactions such as picnics, and then in the post-war period, more so through formal structures in that organised way of soccer clubs and other youth clubs that developed. As I've mentioned here, it was a male endeavour with few opportunities for women to participate directly in sport activity, although spectatorship provided an active way women could participate, and also through social activities. And in this century, we see Greek Australian second, third and fourth generations more directly active in national sport and international sport, representing Australia with a Greek heritage. So I think to conclude, sport continues to serve as a forum for Greek heritage, culture, identity in the diaspora, in both at the same time celebrating Greek identity, but also in integrating the diaspora within Australian culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joy, for that fascinating and nostalgic presentation. I know a lot of people sort of will probably identify with it, especially myself.
Which bit, Nick?
Well, the closest thing to religion in my family would probably be football, and the real football, not that funny game they play here in Melbourne. And so your father must have been a good man, I think. I've got a few questions, but I'll just start off with one. You probably recall the book by Johnny Warren, Wog, Sheilas and Pufters, The History of Australian Soccer. Yep. It was a sort of bestseller. Yep. I was initially involved in that book, and my publisher chickened out because they were too afraid of the title. It doesn't suit an education publisher. Right. But my question is, because you have written a book, Football Passions, when we look at post-World War II migration, and it was like the ethnics that really supported soccer and so forth. But when you look at post-World War II migration, the biggest groups weren't the South Mediterranean migrants. They were from the British Isles. They were the 10-pound poms and so forth. Why did the British or the English create similar ethnic teams like South Melbourne Hellas, the equivalent of, let's say, Melbourne Celtic or, Melbourne Arsenal or something like that? Why didn't you see that development with the British migrants? What's your sort of theory or take on that?
Well, that's a good question, Nick. I think Britishness meant Australianness. It was one and the same. It was like they were Australian, right? I don't think they identify themselves as British, but I think they would have been integrated much more into an Australian.
But soccer is very tribalistic, especially in England. So why wouldn't you take those tribalistic traits here in Australia and adapt a different code?
Say that again?
I said, soccer or football is very tribalistic.
Tribalistic, yeah.
Even more so in the UK.
Yep.
So why wouldn't you take those traits, going up with that sporting tribalism, and transport them here to Australia rather than embrace another code?
Well, I mean, the British, some British embraced the other code, but some didn't, right? I mean, I think there's still, amongst the British here, they saw football primarily as soccer still, and some did go to Australian rules. I think there was not so much the compulsion, to form an ethnic group because Britishness was mainstream here. Yeah. Whereas Greek was so foreign that Greek community felt they needed to come together and form these sporting bodies to maintain that culture, to assert themselves in this society, whereas the British were mainstream, right? Yeah. Now, there is that POM and, all this sort of thing, but there's not quite the need to distinguish oneself. Yeah, I get your point, yeah. That would be the line of thinking I would put to that, Nick. Happy to be proved wrong, but Australia wanted British. They considered themselves as British.
Oh, they ran out. That's why
that's
they turned to this here.
Correct. Yeah. No, absolutely. They saw them. They wanted more British people, and for the British culture to be transported here, not Southern Europeans. So I think there's a question of identity and the importance these clubs serve for that identity that was seen as other here, very other.
Well, and usually, and through sports, especially soccer, it's a way to reassert their identity, especially in the 70s and 80s. Exactly. Which ethnic group, the Dutch or whatever, didn't have such a club? And I would say it's probably one of the reasons the A-League didn't succeed, because it is very tribalistic, and A-League teams were overnight outfits, you know what I mean? So it sort of disenfranchised a lot of people. And
No, I agree. Totally, Nick, yeah.
Any further questions? Oh. Dinner?
Thank you, Joy, that was just beautiful. Oh, and you're one of the few speakers, honestly, that when I saw Nick get the microphone, I thought, oh no, it can't possibly be over. That was just fantastic. I just wanted to share a story in case anyone else has any stories that they might like to add as well. It's a story I've never divulged. I've never thought to tell it except tonight. My parents would always recount this story that they went to a picnic from the Evian community, and they were actually at Brighton, the park on the foreshore, because a lot of the islanders lived around the Bay Area, And my mum ran in a race, and the president declared that his wife came first. And my dad was devastated because he knew my mum came first. But what was so lovely about that day, and what my mum remembered about that day, she said, do you know this lovely Anglo-Australian man came over? And he said, no, this lady came first. And my mum said that from that day, she really developed a real respect for the wider community, and that always struck a chord with me, the ability of sport they barely knew any English, my parents, but they knew enough to know that man was supporting my mum. And You know, sport, there's something really magical about the way, and beautiful, about the way that, yes, sport can segregate, and, you know, we know that, and we know that, but it also brings people together. So I just wanted to contribute. I don't know if anyone else has a story, but that was mine.
That's a beautiful story. Yeah, no, that's a wonderful story. And oh, well, look, it does cut through. I mean, sport in ways that nothing else does, which is phenomenal, really, and continues to, right? And your allegiance moves, like, you know, you can feel, you want, you know, Tsitsipas to win that final, and you sort of feel Greek and patriotic, and then that moves to the Matildas winning the other day, and we're all kind of, you know, I mean, it shifts you around in terms of your allegiance and your identity as well, which I think is very interesting.
Thank you, Joy. It's always you're so easy to listen to and so engaging, so thank you.
Thank you.
Just a comment, and I might be showing my colours here. Don't forget that Luke Beveridge.
Absolutely, yes. He's in the team of the century, Luke Beveridge.
Yep,
yes,
yep.
he is, indeed.
He's got Samos roots as well.
That's
His
right.
grandmother was from Samoa.
Okay. Oh, really? Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, fascinating.
Just to that point of identity, I played a sport that wasn't. I played soccer for about half a year, and then we were playing a Turkish team. And then the dads on the sideline beat up each other, and my dad said, "That's it, you're not playing soccer anymore." So then went and played lacrosse all my life. So, but we did go to games, and we were big fans of soccer. And I remember very, very clearly going to the MCG to watch Irakli, who had come over, play Australia.
Yeah.
And Irakli came over, and 30,000 mainly Greeks have gone to the MCG in the old Southern Stand, and pretty much the vast majority of the fans were all there supporting this Greek team. We're in our Greek colours, we're really up, and we were adamant, and I remember as a kid being adamant, no, we'll go the Greek team. I didn't even know who it actually was. Go the Greek team, until Australia scored. And without anyone really meaning it, a good percentage of the crowd got up and cheered, but almost caught themselves cheering. They almost got, oh, and all sat down pretty quickly to watch this what was a young team of migrants, and it was, you know, a real migrant collection of players score against the team that we all thought we were supporting. And that was the first time I started to understand that, hang on a sec, maybe we support the green and gold team as well as this other team. So. And it eventually transferred to now. The Matildas the other day was a great example of everybody jumping on board with this. But yeah.
Thank you for that comment. It's so true, isn't it? Like you catch yourself out of, you know, unconsciously going this way and that way. So thank you for sharing that. It's true.
There were a few things you missed out in the presentation. You didn't mention anything about cricket. A sport that my parents' generation really love, not. They really can't sort of understand it. I think if you're not from a Commonwealth country, it's almost impossible to appreciate it. No results after sort of five days or something like that. I think there were a few Greek players there as well. But the point I'm trying to make is just look at dynamics of, let's say, multiculturalism and sport. And the biggest migrant group that's been coming here in the last few years has been the Indian community. And don't be surprised when even Australia plays India in Melbourne, it feels like an away match.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting dynamics with some particular sports.
No, it is. Yeah, thanks, Nick. I mean, I guess you can read in the presentation my own biases. And I can declare here and now that cricket is a mystery to me. I can appreciate the spin bowling of Warne, because who can't? The man, threw the ball and the wickets went, and that was great. But seriously, as a game, for me, it just conjures up empire and Britishness and all that, and I find it very, just an inexplicable game. However, I did look for players, Greek players, but I mean, you know, I couldn't find all of them. But
I think there are rumours about Dennis Lilly and
yeah,
so
maybe
forth.
it's a rumour about them.
Yeah, but my experience of growing up in Australia, sort of in the 70s, is playing cricket in the street because because every household didn't have 3 cars.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And jumping in homes and recovering the ball and so forth.
So I guess it depends where you grew up, because where I grew up, there was nowhere to put a cricket, the cricket wickets, right? And so we grew up playing football, because you could kick a footy down the laneways of Fitzroy, but where would you put the wickets and the bails, you know? So, yeah, I guess, I mean, it does come back to you growing up as well, right? And so, you know, how you form allegiances and which sport you do sort of in the end follow, if you follow sport at all. But I think for women it's very different, right? I mean, it really is. And growing up in the inner city here in Melbourne, you know, there were only a few teams you'd follow. But it was a way of being part of the group, forming and identifying with a club, an AFL club, a VFL club as it was in those days. Like, you all became part of the mix. And so it was an entree, you know, to that society, really. And I didn't know much English. My parents didn't know English. My English was very poor before I went to school. So, you know, you could kick a footy though. Yeah. So.
Anyone else want to recall their sporting experiences? Or? Okay, let's bring proceedings to a close. Big round of applause for our speaker tonight, Joy Damousi. Always delivers. Thank you, Joy.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Nick.